Good afternoon. I'm pleased to welcome you to the next session of the 2022 APS Annual Leadership Meeting. Now, you don't need me to tell you that the world is facing a host of scientific and social challenges, ranging from energy and climate to equity and inclusion. Addressing many of these challenges will require scientific collaboration on a global scale. Such collaboration is challenged by a host of limiting factors, including, of course, the pandemic. The upcoming discussion will focus on identifying those limiting factors and finding ways that we can surmount them together. To facilitate this discussion, it is my pleasure to introduce Miles O'Brien. Miles is an independent journalist who focuses on science, technology, and aerospace. He is the science correspondent for the PBS NewsHour, a producer, director, writer, and correspondent for PBS documentary programs such as Nova and Frontline, and an aviation analyst for CNN. Previously, Miles spent over 16 years as a staff correspondent and anchor with CNN, as well as 10 years on the NASA Advisory Council. Please join me in welcoming Miles O'Brien. Miles?
Jonathan, thank you so much. And thank you all for being a part of this session. I think we're going to get into some very interesting subjects for all of us. The challenges that science and scientists face today are indeed global. They are complex. They are existential. And navigating towards solutions is no simple task. It might be easier if we could limit it to the purview of science, but in order for science to succeed with its solutions on big problems like this, it has to deal with the thorny world of political science and communication to the general public, which gets very complicated very quickly. These are thorny challenges, to say the least, and APS does have an important role to play in all this. But just what does that look like? Let's try to explore that by looking at some of the problems, some of the potential solutions, and some of the areas where collaboration might lead us to better solutions. We have an esteemed panel with us. Bill Collins is a senior scientist and director of the Climate and Ecosystem Science Division at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Cherry Murray is professor of physics and the director of the Biosphere 2 Institute at the University of Arizona at Tucson. And Omololu Akin-Ojo is the founding director of the International Center for Theoretical Physics, East African Institute for Fundamental Research in Kigali, Rwanda. And Bill Colglazier is the senior scholar and editor-in-chief, Science and Diplomacy at the AAAS Center for Science and Diplomacy. All familiar faces to the people in the viewing audience, I suspect. Thank you all for being with us. Let's talk about the problems first. Big ones, complex ones, existential, as I just said. Bill Collins, let me begin with you. From where you sit, certainly as somebody who's been on the IPCC for many years and has attempted to marshal scientific resources in the face of the climate emergency, you understand the scope of the problems we face. I just wonder, I'm sure you've thought about this, are the problems we face today really that much more complicated, difficult, and grave than they have been in the past?
Great question, Miles. The answer is yes. And the reason is that the physics of the climate system is a little unforgiving. So we've attempted to kick the can down the road far too long before really embarking seriously on solving the climate problem. And nature and the climate system are essentially telling us that the window for action is closing. And so that means that we have to really rush now to squeeze through that window. And so the challenges have gotten greater precisely because we've delayed trying to solve the problem.
In a perfect world, if science could just go out and do this on its own, would we no longer have a problem?
No, I think we wouldn't, because there are obviously issues that are making sure that the solutions are equitable. They will cost money, so there will have to be investment, and ensuring that that investment is done in a way that maximizes the benefit for as many people as possible is a challenge for which at least I'm not trained. And so this issue around science solutions and their deployment rapidly runs into an all hands on deck proposition, Miles.
Cherry, I'm interested in your thoughts on this. Do you get the sense that these problems are problems which humanity really has never faced at this scale? I suppose we could think about existential threats to the globe and go back to the Cold War and think about when we were talking about mutually assured destruction. Is this different today? I think you're muted there, Cherry. All right.
Say it's a little bit slower than the mutually assured destruction, which is, by the way, still there as an existential issue. But I want to point out, and maybe I could share my screen with what I see, and what I like to point out is these problems that we need to solve globally are all connected to each other. So let me share the screen. This is a series of transitions that the world is going through according to the World in 2050, a publication by IASA, the International Institute for Applied System Analysis. So you can see climate change and energy down at the bottom right, but they are intimately connected with the digital revolution, which I can talk about later, human demographics changing and inequality, as Bill pointed out, the circular economy, and cities becoming smart, and we are losing biodiversity right and left, and those are ecosystem services that serve humanity. So as we're thinking, and in the middle of all this, we have COVID-19, which has pushed us backwards. In order to do solutions, we need every nation in the world to work on these at the same time. And we need all hands on deck, basically. As Bill said, we are running out of time. So I will stop sharing my screen. I just want to point out what APS can do is look at the big picture.
Well, let's tell you what, we're going to get to all those solutions. Let's frame the problems first, and we'll get to the APS solutions in a little bit, okay? Yeah. Omololu, let's, as Cherry just mentioned, it's all hands on deck, all scientists on deck. And, smart minds in sub-Saharan Africa need to be a part of this as well. What are the challenges you see in marshaling resources there in the face of these kinds of problems, particularly when you are faced with a whole other set of problems, which the West in some ways has moved on from?
Oh, okay. So there are quite a number of challenges in this part of the world to be able to facing us when we try to address some of these problems. And of course, the biggest one is funding, but another one that's concomitant with that is actually building capacity. We need to build a lot of capacity here in Africa for people to be able to solve the different problems that we have. So I think, yes, the issue of funding is there, and also the issue of building capacity. Of course, there's also a good thing that we can do, and that's to improve connectivity so that we can all talk together with people from different parts of the world and exchange ideas on how to solve the problems that we face in Africa. Yeah, thanks.
And in order to fully participate and marshal the smart minds in your institute, for example, there are a host of challenges there, aren't there?
Yes. So one of the challenges we have, like I said, has to do with the aspect of connectivity. We need to be connected to people in all over the world that are working on these important problems. We need to connect to them for various reasons. One of them being that we need them to help us to build capacity. We need to build capacity ourselves, but also we need help from other people to be able to build capacity here in Africa particularly. Of course, there's a problem of infrastructure. We need also to build an infrastructure to enable things like that. For instance, we need to be connected digitally so that we can access many of these resources. There are places in Africa that need supply of electricity, either through the grid or off-grid. So there are problems like that we face that limits how much we can, that limits how much we currently are doing. And these are some of the things that we need to solve, of course. Yeah. There are other issues related to health, but I think this is in every place. For instance, if you're sick and you are not healthy, then you cannot contribute to solving those problems. So there are different problems, but then I think it's important to prioritize and to know which ones are the most important and which ones we should tackle first and second and things like that. So, thanks.
So, Bill Colglazier, you have written about the rapid pace of these problems and how they progress relative to the ability seeming of the political structure, the leadership structure of humanity in general to solve them. How are we going to be able to catch up to these problems at the rate we're going?
Yeah, I think that is one of the fundamental questions. Science and technology are moving incredibly fast now, and they're creating great opportunities, but they're also creating great challenges. Even the diplomats and policymakers recognize that how important science and technology is to almost everything they do, and that these changes can disrupt societies and also contribute to conflicts. So besides the big challenges that we're talking about today, dealing with climate change, energy, pandemics, and just as Bill Collins mentioned, that the window is closing and being able to deal successfully with many things related to climate change. At the same time, we have all these other things emerging from new technologies that are moving incredibly fast, whether it's AI, synthetic biology, you name it. So I think what's different in this era from what maybe 70 years ago, our predecessors had to deal with the challenge of dealing with nuclear weapons, which was an existential risk, still is for the world. But now we have all these others that are on top of it, along with nuclear. So I think it is a very challenging time. Important for the science community to engage with the political side.
So that sounds kind of grim. Do you? What is the thing that science needs to be aware of as it faces these problems? I mean, scientists tend to focus on their area of specialty. It requires kind of an assumption that we all understand social science a little bit too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, when I say science, I'm really including the natural sciences, social sciences, medical sciences, engineering sciences. And I think the main lesson for the science community is we have to engage with the political side, with civil society, that in order to contribute not only solutions, but to understand exactly what the needs are from the political side. And I think there have been successes in doing that. So I think we see the kind of things we have to do, and the task is trying to engage rapidly enough to make a difference.
Bill Collins, circling back to you, one of the issues which you talk about is the inherent inequities that are a part of these problems. And as Cherry well pointed out, there's a lot of interrelated problems here that we're addressing all at once, which it's like, building the airplane in flight kind of thing. But when we talk about tackling climate, spending money on that, coming to, achieving a zero carbon economy, how do we address the inherent issues of inequality at the same time?
Well, I think that's a great question, Miles, and it deals with both the issues around how do we prepare populations for what's coming, but also share the solutions with them. And So there are issues on sort of the impact side, which have to do with inequitable distribution of the impact of droughts, which are getting more severe in certain parts of the world, like the Sahel. But there's also the issue on making sure that humanity as a whole benefits from the latest and greatest advances, for example, in clean tech and green energy. And so I think this is really sort of a two-pronged push. It's a push to make sure that people can thrive, as we really collectively need to thrive together, rise together in the face of climate change, but also share the solution technologies as widely as possible. Otherwise, people around the world who are developing their economies and who have 1/10 the energy intensity of an American are going to look at what's happened and say, thanks, you had a great party and now you're closing the door on us. That's not going to work as a solution. We really have to share what's coming next that we think will benefit everyone.
Cherry, do you think science does a good job of being inclusive, not just of when it looks at problems, but also the people it turns to solve those problems?
The answer is no, but it's doing a better job. For example, Omololu was talking about human capacity building, education, starting from pre-kindergarten is critically important for the entire world, especially important for providing the talent that is needed to provide local solutions. And the solutions are going to need to be local for all of these problems. And what APS can do, back to APS, is really focus on education. And as was mentioned in several previous sessions, education of children, creativity, critical thinking. That's extremely important. And that means for everyone, that means inclusive. Interestingly, there's more inequity inside nations than there is between nations. And you can see that in the US, you can see that in China. We have great inequity, and we need to work on that. And the way to do that is, one way to do that is education.
Omololu, I suspect you have a few thoughts on this particular subject of inequity and education and the role that education plays in uplifting people who are disadvantaged. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think this is very important, and I think we should have a target towards training a critical number of people in every country. Because I'm from Africa, I will say in every country in Africa, I think it's very important to have a target of training a critical number of people. Like some people have said, I think we should start early, like in primary schools and then high schools or secondary schools, all the way to college. So if you start early and help people to think critically, I think this would be very important. And then they can profile different solutions to different problems, but you need to get them to start thinking about these things early and start developing a way of thinking, of critical thinking. In this part of the world, unfortunately, we have a lot of rote memorization. So this is one of the things we have to address. I think it's good to memorize, but also more important to think critically. So I think for us in Africa, at least, this is very important to develop capacity, train people, especially at the earlier stages of their education, and help them to be great thinkers and people that are innovative and creative and really work to solve the problems that we all face. Yeah.
I'm curious, the bright young minds that are at your institute, what are the problems they are interested in solving?
Oh, one of the problems they're interested in solving is the problem with energy. So there are many places that don't have constant power supply, or the power supply is expensive in some places, especially in the rural places, and it's quite expensive to extend the grid to those places. So one of the solutions that they need is solar power from solar cells. So this is one of the problems that people are really interested in solving in Africa. Another one has to do with water and sanitation. So people are interested in solving this problem of water and sanitation in Africa, so that they can provide good and clean water for drinking, and also proper sanitation. There is recently also, people are aware of problems with cooling, like we need to provide cooling. In the US, cooling is not a problem, or in the West, cooling isn't a problem. In Africa, we build houses, we don't need insulation, but we really need cooling. So people are beginning to think of these ones. And of course, there's the problem with health that people want to solve in different areas. We consider there's a lot of biodiversity, and if we could harness many of the plants that we have to create new drugs. So this is one of the things that people are interested in.
So it's not like they're coming to you, and this harkens back to what Cherry was saying, that it's all local, right? It's think globally, act locally, I guess. These are very local kind of parochial problems, and not so much as I want to solve the climate emergency per se, even though when you're electrifying using solar panels, you're doing the right thing, right? I mean, is it, are they thinking more about problems that are closer to home, and to what extent would you prefer they were thinking a little bigger?
Okay, this is a good question. I think it's hard to think about. Okay, I think it's hard to think about global problems when you have pressing needs. Okay, so you have needs in your home. There's no power, your kids wants to study. So this is one of the problems that people will think of immediately and try to solve in different ways, either throwing some money at it or thinking about other ways to solve it. Yes, there are other bigger problems that I wish people would think about, but I think it's hard to get everybody to think of those bigger problems where there are more pressing problems, like local problems around, even problems with transportation, getting cheap fuel for transportation. So these are problems that people feel and they see and feel, and they would like to solve these ones. Yes, it would be good to solve the bigger problems, but at this level, I think we are focused on the problems that we see and we feel almost daily. Yeah. Actually, one of the things that is not straightforward is how interconnected the problems are. So let's say you see a farmer that has problem with drought. It's hard for the farmer to think that the problem could be connected with climate change and the global warming. But these are interconnected problems. So he may try to just solve the problem and provide irrigation for his crops or plants, but the problems are connected to the global one of climate change and warming. So yes, he will try to solve this immediate one, but still, I think, like you said, it's important for us to think about global problems because they affect what we feel locally.
Okay, we should encourage everybody out there to participate in this conversation. If you're in the audience, there's a way for you to send me a question, and I'm seeing one right now, which I'm going to put to Bill Colglazier. And if anybody else wants to take a whack at it, feel free. As Cherry said, solutions need to be local, and one way APS can help is through education. Is there a way to encourage cooperation between physicists and local governments to address acute issues? Bill Colglazier, you want to take the first stab at that? And if anybody else wants to weigh in, feel free.
Sure. although I started out life as a theoretical physicist, I spent most of my career kind of the interface of science and public policy and diplomacy, and was lucky to have several mentors that tried to make a difference, even though they never served in government, and affecting not only our society, but other countries. And it ranged all the way from education to arms control to environmental issues. So there are, I went on a sabbatical to the Academy of Sciences in 1991 to head the international programs. And there are programs that are collaborations between science institutions around the world trying to strengthen K through 12 science education, more inquiry-based, like scientists actually do it. There are collaborations that work on environmental issues together, on things like arms control. And so I think there are ways where scientists from different countries can engage across borders and nationalities. But although you mentioned that I gave a grim prognosis of our current environment, ultimately I'm an optimist. And that's because in talking with sort of young scientists and engineers everywhere, including when I was science advisor in the State Department across the world, most students are actually quite idealistic. They want to use their expertise to make the world a better place. And so that gave me a lot of hope that even with our challenges, we can reach solutions.
Yeah, we old folks are not the right people to talk to, are we? But you say you're an optimist, really? I mean, is it, in a sense, though, Bill, is that a maybe a little bit of a cop-out? We're the boomers that screwed things up. Here, it's your problem?
Well, there may be some of that. I'm old enough to recognize that in the conflict, sometimes politics is a much stronger force than science. But I believe that in the long run, that science can make a difference. And I just mentioned what I have in the background there. When I went to the national academies, did their national programs, among the programs I oversaw was one, the Committee on Scholarly Communication with the People's Republic of China. We got an office in Beijing because that's the way science was facilitated between the two countries back in the 80s and the 90s. The arms control discussions with the Russians, then with Russia and the former states of the Soviet Union. In Africa, trying to help science institutions there become better advisors to their governments, their public health agencies. So I've seen that science can actually have a very powerful role. And so in the long run, I think we just have to keep pressing and trying to engage and move in that direction.
Bill Collins, politics and science and climate, you're right at the center of all that. I'm curious, when you guys are sitting around the virtual IPCC table or wherever that is, or if there's an IPCC saloon and you're having a beer at the end of the day, and it's a warm beer, I gather, but you're having, do you guys, do you bemoan the fact that you haven't been able to move the needle more? And I say that with great respect on what you've accomplished, but is there frustration?
Yeah, it sometimes feels like we're piling on adverbs. Like we're very certain, now we're very, very certain, now we're very, very,
we're
very
really,
certain.
really certain. Yeah.
That does become sort of a tiresome exercise. The background here, Miles, is that the IPCC is basically commissioned by the UN in service to its member countries. And the final summary for policymakers is signed off on by the member states in the UN. So they're fully aware of our findings, and those findings have not changed appreciably, except they've become more certain since the first IPCC assessment in 1990. My takeaway from this is that we need to broaden the channels of communication. So just communicating with world governments is not enough anymore. We need a hearts and minds proposition that reaches out to the activists in the world, the younger people who are not the people who we're talking to in the UN. We scientists need a much broader and better suite of means of communicating the science through a hearts and minds proposition to people writ large, because we're talking to people who are, like you said, they haven't budged the needle in 30 years. So we can't keep repeating what we've been doing. We have to talk to other people.
Well, I would contend, and again, I say this with great respect, but there is a language of science which tends to Well, in my business, we'd say you guys bury the lead, right? You start with all the uncertainties and all the things that it might not be. And then at the very bottom of the thing, it's like, oh yeah, the world's going to end, by the way. And I think there's a fundamental challenge here on understanding how scientists work, how they communicate, and that disconnect with the general public is part and parcel of what we're talking about. And as you add adverbs, you guys are getting more and more worried. It's clear, but when we talk to you privately at that IPCC saloon, you're really worried, and you don't say that because you're constrained by the scientific method and the process and all the mores and customs that you have. So how do we figure that one out? How do we communicate in a way that really moves those hearts and minds and yet honors the scientific process?
Well, it comes down to reaching people's value propositions. How do they see themselves? How do they see their communities being improved by adopting solutions? And I want to come back to something that Omololu was touching on earlier. We need to make doing the right thing for the climate the easy thing and the thing that benefits one's families, one's communities, so that when you improve local transportation services, when you get cleaner water, when you put in new energy systems, those systems are inherently more sustainable. They're more, they improve the climate. And so we need to think about, making solutions part and parcel of what people do every day, and making sure that those solutions do right by the environment. And then we will have cracked a big, the hardest nut to crack.
Well, greed and fear are good motivators. I think we've tried fear for a while. It doesn't seem to be working. Cherry, why don't you weigh in? And then I have a question from the audience for you. Go ahead.
I just wanted to weigh into that point. Completely agree. The incentives are incredibly important. One incentive for communities everywhere is a good economic development. We must make the solutions pair with reducing inequalities and a good economic development, at the same time solving a global problem of climate change and biodiversity loss, which is as existential a problem as climate change. It's a local solution where everybody wins. It is possible to do.
Okay, question from the audience here, Cherry, and I want you to take this. Could the panelists stop driving their cars right now? That is how hard it will be to bring down our carbon emissions. What are we doing to rearrange our cities to make the carbon emission reduction we need possible? That's right in your wheelhouse, Cherry. Go.
Yeah. So excellent question. We are moving from, let's just say by 2050, we are moving from an ownership model of, let's just say, transportation solutions to a service model. So in cities around the world, for example, Singapore, I happen to know, people use public transportation. Public transportation will be automatic driving vehicles, which you can call, and people are not using cars. The city needs to be designed for that. Singapore has the will to do that. But other cities around the world are also thinking about this. And this comes down to the local solutions. Why I am optimistic, Bill Colglazier is optimistic too, is that we are seeing cities around the world, we are seeing communities, we are seeing companies, not just giving lip service to these issues. We're seeing the European Union saying, we are going to have a circular economy and you, companies, are going to do it. And so it is showing that we can do these things. And, the more cities that do this and show that the people are better off, the easier it will get. Another thing I wanted to point out is in the developing world, they can leapfrog over what the developed world infrastructure is. So for example, in Brazil, the substance that come from the telecommunications industry from way back. They put in cell phone service before landlines. They didn't need landlines. We can do the same thing with mini grids in Africa. They don't need to connect to the major grid.
So there is kind of an opportunity embedded in all that. And I want to ask Omololu about that a little more. But quickly, Bill Collins pointed out his cars are electric and 100% renewably powered, which he said in the text. Cherry, what's your car situation? Putting you on the spot here.
I have a Prius, so it's hybrid.
Okay.
It's
hybrid, that's good.
hybrid.
All right.
Okay.
Bill Colglazier, what are you driving these days?
A hybrid, but I've also unfortunately got an SUV.
Okay. Well, that takes care of that. And then Omololu, I want to ask you about this leapfrog technology, but first, what do you drive? I imagine, I'm going to take a wild guess that in Rwanda, the electric vehicle infrastructure is not quite there yet. Am I right?
Yeah, this is correct, but we are building it. There's a company, I think, from China that has come and they are building, assembling electric cars or motorcycles. I don't know which one, but I think they're assembling some electric vehicles. Let me answer the question. Actually, I'm sorry to disappoint you.
I'm sorry, what do you drive though? What do you drive?
Yeah, that's what I want to tell you. I'm sorry to disappoint you.
Okay, all right. So let's talk about how.
Let me tell you what I drive. Yeah.
Okay, go for it.
It's very disappointing. I actually drive a V8 Jeep Cherokee.
Oh wow.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
You like a big vehicle, a muscle vehicle.
Yeah, and it drinks a lot of gas.
All right, let's put that aside. Let's talk about opportunities in the emerging world, akin to skipping the power, the phone lines and going straight into cellular. In your case, many cases where you're dealing with issues of electrification, you're not going to build a fossil fuel plant. You're probably going to look at solar or wind or whatever. Do you see that as an opportunity?
Yes, definitely. So this is an opportunity for us to avoid some of the mistakes that people made in developing countries when they were developing. And then we can just take the technology that they currently have. For instance, if there's a country, okay, there's none, I don't think there's any, but if there's a country in Africa now that wants to develop telecommunications, they can just jump straight to 4G, and they don't have to first do a 3G coverage and then a 4G coverage. And so this is an opportunity in Africa that people can leverage on. Yeah.
All right, we have a question for the audience, and I'm going to send this in the direction of Bill Colglazier. Does the scientific community, e.g. climate scientists, do enough to reach out, listen, and find common ground with those with other needs, e.g. having the conversation with climate change deniers about resilience and adaptation? I'm curious if anybody in this panel bothers with deniers anymore, but Bill Colglazier, what are your thoughts? Is there enough outreach to folks who, if not outright deniers, might be a little more skeptical?
I'll tell you, many years I oversaw the reports of the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, which try to produce an objective, non-political assessment of the state of scientific knowledge on issues, including what is not known from science. And on lots of reports on climate change going back to the 1970s. So many of these things have been known for a long time, even though we've learned a lot over the intervening years. There's some very distinguished scientists, members of the Academy of Sciences, who are climate deniers, believe it or not. They don't fit in the mainstream of current. If you took an Academy of Sciences report about the state of science, they are outliers in that. So there are always going to be a few people of that sort. I think what we have to do is to challenge and debate them. They're obviously going to present their views. So in addition to those that really do not have the training in scientific fields, there are always going to be some scientists that are out on the fringe. So getting back to your question of what should we do in terms of engaging with people that have these alternative views. If it's straightly misinformation, or they politicized it, they have ulterior motives, they're doing it, they have to be challenged as well. But even reputable scientists are outside the mainstream. They don't reflect really the best scientific knowledge of the present. We have to do the same sort of thing and you have to convey that to the public and to the decision makers. Not always an easy task.
Well, let me ask you this, though. I mean, how much time do you spend trying to convince a member of the Flat Earth Society that the Earth is spherical? Do you bother with that? I mean, are we at that point when it comes to climate deniers?
No, not the Flat Earth Society, but those scientists whose names I didn't give you, that are distinguished scientists that have been friends. We've had many knockout, drag-out fights. And right. I think that their views are influenced very much by their value judgments on other things, unfortunately. And it's sort of clouded in what I think they're sticking to what the best science is today.
Well, Bill Collins, you must have some thoughts on this one. How do you handle the hardcore climate emergency deniers? And, it's a diminishing number of people.
One thing I've tried is actually inviting them onto the papers where I've said that I think they're mistaken, just so that we could have a gentle person's discussion around it. Uh-huh. That approach didn't work, unfortunately, but we certainly did try and reach out to them.
Why didn't it work? Just out of curiosity, how did that go? Was it some kind of food fight that came out of it, or what happened?
No, fortunately. I mean, I sort of divide the world into two camps here, Miles. Those who want to sort of debate the issue through Twitter, and I don't engage with them at all. And those who actually want to use the scientific method, and then great, we'll have a spirited discussion. I did want to mention that there are other ways of communicating. And one thing I'm involved with and have been the lead scientist for now since its inception is the Climate Music Project. And we are composing pieces of music now to reach broad audiences to convey the urgency around climate science. And the idea is to get out of recitation of facts and instead to reach people artistically. And I think this is coming back to the point I was saying earlier, we really need to broaden the way that we communicate with people. And I think you can reach someone who may be a skeptic if you play them a country music song about climate change, maybe. I mean, that's one way we are thinking about that quite seriously, by the way. I have roots in Nashville, so we may do it.
You got some lyrics planned,
Not yet, but we are talking to people in Nashville.
My girl left me, my pickup died, and I'm trading it all in for electric or something. I don't know. That's all I can do in short order. But all right, so I've got a question for you, Cherry, from the audience. Actually, two, because people are quite interested in transportation issues. First off is one thing to note is how local conditions may be more conducive to, say, public transit than others, given their current status. For example, it's difficult to introduce public transit into a sprawling city like Houston. I assume you've thought long and hard about those kinds of problems. How do you?
Yeah, I think automatic driving vehicles will be the public transit. Also, the thing that it's amazing to see what Singapore is doing. They are not as sprawling as Houston, that's for sure. But they've decided they're going to put public transit on the second level of roads. They're building a completely second level of roads over the entire city. The bottom will be a park where people can walk and bicycle. And the second level is going to be public transit, which includes buses, but also automatic vehicles that you can call with your cell phone. So in Houston, you could call an automatic vehicle with your cell phone. How long it takes to get to you might be an issue. I do admit that.
Well, I mean, you have to, when you talk to young people, their view of the automobile is so different than the way we grew up, right? I mean, a lot of them don't even want to own a car, or they're just Ubering around. I think there's been a shift there, hasn't there?
Yeah. When I was living in Cambridge and when I spent 2 years in Washington, D.C., I did not drive my car. I Ubered if I had to get far out.
Yeah, why would you? The parking,
parking is impossible, right?
I just find it wonderful to sit in the back and do a little bit of work as opposed to thinking about the jackass ahead of me who's driving like a fool, or behind me, whatever the case may be. So I think that the way you describe that, if we can The autonomous vehicle problem is not an insignificant one, though, as we've seen with Waymo and others.
Yeah, sure.
It's the old baby buggy in the parking lot issue, which is not an easy one to solve, is it?
No, it isn't, and nor is it easy to solve with human drivers.
True.
I mean, it's the same issue, right?
But then we have somebody to blame and sue. You know, who do we sue when the autonomous vehicle hits somebody? And we like our litigation. We gotta deal with that.
But who do you sue? The vehicle, the taxi service, the software developer, the algorithm writer. This is not trivial. I agree. Yeah.
All right. Question from the audience here. What do the panelists think of the idea that national competition rather than cooperation maybe at times spur faster progress on pressing issues? Okay, so we've been talking about collaboration. I'll keep it with you, Cherry, because you had some interesting thoughts on this. I offered up in one of our conversations in advance of this idea that, well, you know, if let's say China or Germany happen to be better at solar, why not just let them do that and we do something else better? And then we collectively solve all the world's problems. And she called me, I believe there was you naive little fool or something to that effect, right? I may be embellishing slightly, but naive was used.
Used, yes.
How do we allow, I mean, let's face it, the scientific endeavor, humans are competitive, science is competitive, we're nationalistic, we're geopolitical. When we talk about this kumbaya moment of bringing the world together in science, are we being a little naive?
Well, let me distinguish between, let's just say, nature-based solutions to climate change, like keep the forests alive, versus which, you know, there's no competition there except for economic development in the locality, and energy. So nations have always been competitive about energy. And in fact, I would recommend if you haven't read Dan Yergin's book, The Prize, do read it because it is a wonderful history of the oil and gas industry and the closeness to national security issues. Oil and gas was developed for military purposes. And so nations are competitive on energy technologies. And I will point out that that is true today, specifically for the energy grid, which is a cybersecurity threat issue. Since we're talking about electrifying everything and running the electricity off of renewable resources and possibly nuclear, renewable resources, as we all know, are intermittent. Therefore, the grid needs to be robust against intermittency. It also needs to be robust against cybersecurity and hacks, either by bad actor nations or bad actor people. And so if, for example, Australia does not trust the makers of the grid technology or build it themselves, that's a problem for them. And we've seen this.
Okay, so I'm going to run down the panel. Cherry's made her position clear. Omololu, competition versus collaboration. Can they live together, get along? What's more effective when we look at solving big problems, or do we need both somehow?
Yes, thank you, Miles. So I think we need both, but we could either try to work together, or what will inevitably happen is that countries that are competing against one another, some of them will group together to outsmart the other countries. So say country A is competing against country B, and then they will find out that if they collaborate with country C, they can beat country B. So then things like this will happen where some countries will join forces together So I think, for instance, there's the European Union where European countries came together. I'm not saying they came together to beat the US, but it would have been difficult to compete against the US if they hadn't come together. So I think things like this will happen, where countries will come together. Yes, it's competitive, but some countries will come together to beat the competition. Yeah.
Bill Colglazier, competition versus collaboration. Where do you come down?
Well, scientists both collaborate and they compete. I'm a fan of science diplomacy, was trying to use scientific expertise, scientific knowledge to make progress on our global national issues. Foreign ministries do it too. They're concerned about the national interests. So science diplomacy can be used for methods of competition as well as cooperation. And sometimes they can be combined in one. For example, collaborating with the Chinese in a certain area, we can learn exactly what they're doing. If the US is involved, it can perhaps be better at setting the standards for the world, which would be good for our economic system rather than let the Chinese do it. So I think it's always going to be a combination of cooperation and collaboration.
Isn't it potentially, when you look at some of the experiences the US has had with Chinese science and collaboration there, that has backfired in the past?
Well, I think backfired is too strong a word. Certainly there was a period when China was opening up where the US did altruistic things, trained a lot of Chinese scientists who turned out to be the leading scientists, many of whom have gone back to China. I think we've gained, my personal view is we've gained as much as China did through that cooperation. But I thought it was a great session this morning, the APS sponsored, on looking at the security issues versus openness. Have to strike the right balance. And I think we can do that. But I think it's in the US interest to maintain international scientific cooperation to the maximum extent that we can do it without compromising core security interests.
Okay, I just got a note. I've got to stop here for a moment. I was making fun of a country music song and I used a Southern accent, and I believe I've offended some people. I apologize. I was just simply trying to do my best country Western accent. No offense was intended or implied, and I'm very sorry to anybody who feels offended by that. Bill Collins, competition versus collaboration.
Well, we've seen some great examples where competition and then the sharing of technology has actually been very beneficial. So the fact that the price of solar cells dropped so dramatically was because China went through a phase of deploying them at very large scale. And we have directly benefited in the United States in the fact that China took that competitive posture. I believe, although I'd be happy to stand corrected, that something similar happened with the large-scale deployment of wind power in Europe, from which we've also benefited. The creation of truly gigantic turbines, and it's just awesome landing in Copenhagen now and seeing the array of solar wind farms stretched all along the coastline. So that's an example where the competition proved to be very healthy and very beneficial. The places where I see there's the risk of competition, Miles, that's going to arise here is going to be associated with the fact that an unprecedented climate is also going to create unprecedented opportunity. And so this may slip a little bit more into the political sphere, but I think we should all be very worried about what's going to happen in the Arctic over the next few decades. That's a situation where countries have been running exercises on intercepting each other's ships that are now able to cross the Arctic in an ice-free future. And it's that sort of competition, because the climate is changing out from underneath us, I think is going to pose types of risks we have not seen before, and we will have to be prepared for.
I mean, do you envision conflict as a result of this?
Well, yes. I mean, countries that are friendly to us have actually run exercises where they've had to intercept in their wargame exercises rogue U.S. ships. Russia has planted a flag on the bottom of the Arctic Ocean. I think largely as a symbolic gesture, but once the Arctic is ice-free, then there's also a large amount of fossil fuel deposits at relatively low depth below the ocean surface. And people are now viewing an ice-free Arctic as an excuse to go look for oil inside the Arctic Circle, as if we need more of the same.
Yeah. All right. So much for all that optimism, Bill Colglazier. I don't know.
Well,
all right. So let me ask you this, Bill Collins, in the context of the IPCC or in this panel in general, is anyone considering the correlation between population growth and the climate emergency and the loss of biodiversity? Is that question even allowed? Is this a bit of a taboo, you think, Bill?
I can't speak to that question exactly from my pay grade or my perspective from the IPCC. We were, just to explain that process a little bit, Miles, we were handed scenarios and told we could not assign value judgments to these scenarios. So we look at scenarios that have 12 billion people on the planet by later on in the 21st century, which is about nearly 50% greater than the world's current population. It seems almost insane. We were asked not to assign value judgments to these scenarios and instead to provide their implications for the climate system back to the people who commissioned the report from us. So we are not being invited to really look at that question very directly as part of the IPCC at all. We're told to be studiously neutral, regardless of our personal feelings about whether or not the scenarios are insane or not. And that's just, those are the rules of the road.
So you're just told not to make that part of the discussion in essence.
Right. We are handed scenarios and told to run these through our very large elaborate computers and to fork over the numbers and to graph the results and then to present the results and pick one, but we are not allowed to assign policy judgments to them.
Cherry, you're raising your hand. Go.
Yes, I'm raising my hand. And Bill Colglazier and I have both been members of the 10-member group for the technology facilitation mechanism of the UN. And that group does put together, the problem with the IPCC is that it's in its silo. The 10-member group goes across all of, as I looked at the transformations that we're going through. And I will point out that education is the one thing across the world, particularly education of girls, will reduce the population. It is known, call it human psychology fact. And this is why it's important to look at all of the sustainable development goals together.
Omololu, question for you from the audience. What advice would you give to a young physicist in a resource-poor region that wants to use their education to solve issues within their borders, but worries there won't be adequate support? Certainly in your wheelhouse, sir.
Yeah, so this is an important question. And I think the first thing I will say will be such a person should first get adequate education, get adequate training, and improve your training. There's a tendency to think you have enough education when you don't. Okay. So it's good to try to improve your training in different ways. Yes, you can use your means like over the internet. And so this is one important thing. At the same time, also, you can reach out to other scientists, maybe by email or by contacting them. I think one of the things APS should do also is to have some programs where we can reach out to people in resource-poor regions. I think APS is doing something. There was this innovation funds that was given to a particular group, and the group did something related to this. So I think this is one thing that APS will continue to do to empower people in resource-poor regions and connect with them through different means. Thank you.
Bill Colglazier, I want to go back to this question of collaboration versus competition. What happens if we don't collaborate? What happens then if we all kind of go our separate ways? And we can talk for a moment, and I know Bill Collins wants to get in on this. When we start thinking about some of the plans B and C for climate, which would involve geoengineering, this gets very quickly into the idea that, one nation or even an individual could do something that really affects the planet. How mandatory is it that we maintain this collaboration collectively?
I really do think it is essential, and I am a little bit more optimistic. I mean, even with the Paris Climate Agreement in Glasgow, of course, those countries that they're voluntary agreements about what they're going to do nationally. I was just involved 2 days ago in a session with a bright young scientist who was in the State Department, is now one of our key climate negotiators. And he's essentially leading for the US the discussion of trying to, and what countries promise they're going to do in terms of their carbon emissions. How do you really make sure that they're telling the truth, that as you try to ratchet down through public opinion, through pressure internationally. So I still think that even with the great divergence between governments, that there's a lot we can do in trying to collaborate on certain issues. I don't want to give up on that. But then on something like geoengineering, again, we're going to have to rely on a UN or a consensus to regulate, what is going to be permissible in that realm. So again, we're forced back into looking at how can we collaborate to come up with the rules of the road. So I think if everybody goes into their own camp, I think it's going to be to the detriment of all countries.
So, Bill Collins, let's talk a little bit more about that. I want to continue on this subject because I'm fascinated by it. It does sound like a novel. As a matter of fact, I think you were an advisor to the one we're referring to here. But how big a concern is that all of this talk of collaboration and global approach could unravel very quickly in the face of these, I don't know if we want to say Hail Mary, but, sort of last-ditch efforts to cool the planet?
Well, first, let me point out that the scenarios I was just alluding to, there's a very clear trend line amongst them, which is that the more cooperation there is, the cooler we can keep the climate. This comes back to the point that Bill was just making. That's a very clear through line through all the IPCC assessments that cooperation is better for the environment. The challenge that we face is that if mitigation, which has been studied extensively, doesn't work, people may be tempted to slam on the brakes in other ways. And one of these is by geoengineering, and there are a variety of ways of doing it. One of them is essentially creating an artificial volcano. When people first studied this, they realized there was an inherently inequitable solution because Pinatubo caused exacerbations of drought in many parts of the world. And so this is something where the Band-Aid, applies to some people, but it doesn't apply to others. And I would also say that the science behind geoengineering is at a much less mature stage. So it's even, it's something where I think if we're going to go with Plan B, to Bill's point, we need to be agreed on the fact that everyone figure out a way that everyone benefits, and not that it just benefits a few.
Well, that's probably a little easier said than done, isn't it? Right? I mean,
absolutely.
We could really be up against a scenario where the planet is at uncomfortable temperatures. We're certainly headed in that direction. I sort of see this dilemma maybe a little closer than we hope.
Yeah, well, there's now a fairly large cottage industry that's devoted to looking at trying to remove some of the worst side effects of geoengineering. And there's sort of a growing academic arm of the climate community that's looking into this. I think the one thing that's allowing me to sleep a little bit more easily at night is that the challenge of reproducing something like Pinatubo right now is beyond a technical grasp, but I don't know how much longer that statement will be true.
Cherry, do you share those kinds of concerns?
I do. In fact, there are small companies out there, startups, who are talking about seeding the oceans And we don't know just as in putting sulfate into the atmosphere, we don't know all the ramifications of this. I think we need to understand it, and we definitely need to govern these technologies better.
Bill Colglazier, you still optimistic?
Yes, I try to be anyway, although I have to.
We haven't ruined that in the past 20 minutes, have we?
Well, no, the last couple of years made it a little more challenging as well. Let me just go back to what Sherry was saying in Omololu. Sherry said both of us have been involved with the role of science, technology, innovation for the Sustainable Development Goals at the UN, co-chairing an advisory committee appointed by the UN Secretary General. And these Sustainable Development Goals include the social, economic, environmental goals, peace and security. And among the social goals, as Sherry said, include education, include gender diversity, which have an impact on population. But all these things you have to, if the world is going to come up with solutions that can actually maximize progress on all these goals, it's got to find out how you maximize the synergies and deal with the conflicts between them. So I think looking holistically is also one of the important things that we have to include in how we're going to address these problems in the future. So I am still an optimist, because take the IPCC. The IPCC, I think, is one of the best examples we have of science diplomacy. It's a partnership between the science community and between the political community. And it made great progress that helped lead to the Paris Climate Agreement getting bigger support for dealing with this issue. So we have to look at those kind of collaborations, I think, if we're going to push the needle.
Sherry, I interrupted you as you were coming up with, kind of a to-do list for the APS. That is, after all, what we're all about here. So we should probably circle around to some of the suggestions this esteemed panel has for the APS to play a role in all the things we've been discussing: collaboration, competition, climate, you name it. And that confluence of problems that you laid out in that chart, which are, devilishly not just complicated, but interconnected. To what extent can the APS even move the needle in that context?
I think Bill just said it, that the APS must look at these things holistically. You can't just stay in your lane. I'm a physicist, therefore I'm not going to worry about, gender equity in the globe. No, you need to worry about gender equity in the globe. So I would say APS embrace the global challenges and realize that they're complicated and they involve politics, social science, biology, chemistry, economics, and physics. It's not just physics.
That's a lot for, you're asking, are you asking too much of the organization in a sense? It's a group of physicists, and what we've really been nibbling at here is how the problems don't fit into the silos, do they?
No, I think a group of physicists talking only to physicists are not going to be able to solve the problems. However, I will point out what Omololu said. A group of physicists in the developed world providing, call it capacity building in the developing world can help. But I think APS needs to talk to other scientific societies, including behavioral science, if they're going to come up with, how do we educate young people in physics, communication of science? How do we educate them to be able to deal with anti-science? All of that is the right thing that APS is something that APS could do. Educate physicists to be a little broader in their thinking.
Omololu, I want to hear your thoughts on what the role is for the APS, but I'll add a question for the audience as part of this. So it's an embedded question. Do scientists in the developing world have adequate access to the broader scientific community so they can be a part of the solutions? And I assume that might be part of your answer anyway.
Okay, so let me answer this question from the audience first, and then I'll make a contribution to the way that I think APS can move the needle. So the short answer to that is no, we don't. We do not have adequate access to the broader scientific community. It's amazing. I have some access because, okay, my supervisor is in the US, my PhD supervisor is in the US, and I have collaborators in different parts of the world. And still, it amazes me how sometimes I learn something from these collaborators that I did not know myself. I thought I was abreast of everything, but then I found that, oh, there's this recent work that was done by this person already. Or maybe I'm thinking about an idea like, oh, let's try this method. And then someone tells me, oh, you know, a couple of years ago, someone already did it. Okay. So the short answer is we don't have adequate access, and it would be good for us to have more access. What can APS do? I think APS can lead a big drive to train, say in Africa, to train 100,000 scientists and science teachers in 5 years, and 100,000 engineers and technologists in 5 years. So that would be like 200,000, you know. I'm not saying APS should do it, but they can lead the drive by organizing a meeting of ministers of education and ministers of science and technology in different countries, and proposing this to them so that there's a big drive, a big push to train science teachers, to train scientists, and to train technologists and engineers. You can set a target to say, okay, we want to push a drive for them. I mean, yes, we have to study this to see. I came up with this number because there are like 54 countries in Africa, and if you train like 2,000 scientists in every country and 2,000 engineers and technologists in every country, I think this will push the needle quite some ways. So I think if you just take baby steps and try to convince one country here or one country there, I'm not sure we're going to have the big impact that I think is important. So I think APS to have a big plan like this, a big plan to train 100,000 scientists and science teachers and 100,000 engineers and technicians within the next 5 years. So APS can help talk with the leaders, have a meeting with the leaders. Yes, APS together with ACS, American Chemical Society, AMRS, American Material Research Society, and different other societies, and bring them together to try to make this as an agenda for Africa. They will give it a fancy name and try to make a push like this. So this is my suggestion.
Bill Collins, what is your suggestion for APS?
I guess one suggestion would be to start close to APS's wheelhouse and to encourage the physics community to really engage in the complete transformation of our energy and societal infrastructure that's going to be required to solve climate change. I mean, this is something which is, there are a lot of very rich scientific problems that remain to be solved. Fusion, the energy intensity of computation. I mean, coming back to Sherry's point, the stability of the grid's going to have to be completely re-engineered, and there's actually a very deep set of physics problems around how to make that work. This is something that you know, it's only a slight swerve for the APS membership to engage in that way, and that would be hugely influential. But I also think, to Omololu's point, the idea of fostering international collaborations and seeing whether or not we can encourage investment from both the US government and other countries in our partners in the European Union and elsewhere, to really think about promoting collaboration across between the hemispheres, frankly, would be hugely influential. As I pointed out earlier, the climate gets cleaner the more cooperation there is. And so I think those are two things the APS could do. That would both be, coming back to the point you were making earlier, Miles, sort of speaking to the skill sets of the physicists, but also really being influential and impactful.
So does the climate get dirtier the more competition there is?
That's what the scenarios that we run routinely suggest, that when there is a lack of cooperation at the, as Bill mentioned earlier, at the level of the Paris Accords, then you get a dirtier world.
Interesting. All right, Bill Colglazier. Oh, go ahead, finish up, please.
Well, I think there's the other, I wanted to touch on this issue around the Sustainable Development Goals that Bill and Sherry alluded to earlier. The other thing that we need to recognize is that the work by the APS on these solutions could have very immediate and substantial, tangible benefits. I mean, if I lower the carbon dioxide, Miles, in the room where you're sitting, you can't taste it, you can't smell it, you can't see it. How do you know that I've reduced the carbon dioxide? But if I go to parts of East Asia, where millions of people are dying through the inhalation of particulate pollution every year, and this is according to the World Health Organization, and provide them with a much cleaner way of cooking food, that has a gigantic and immediate social health benefit. And that's the sort of thing where we need to make the long-term solution and the immediate thing that people can see with their own eyes. Those two things need to align.
But it's probably not too hard to find alignments like that, I imagine, when you start really looking at it.
We've had my postdoctoral mentor and scientists at Berkeley Lab both have worked long and hard on the issue on cooking stoves. But that's just one of many examples. I think we need to be focused on not only the long-range issue on climate, but making sure that people see benefits from the new solutions in their backyard because their lives are better. And that needs to happen not 10 years from now, it needs to happen now.
Bill Colglazier, question for the audience for you. Government funding often comes with limitations when international collaborations are involved. How can APS offer equitable resources internationally when government regulations limit access by individuals outside of the US? Good question.
Yeah, let me put in the framework first of answering your question of what should the APS or what might the APS do?
Yeah,
and
fine.
It'll fit in with it. Actually, the APS is doing a lot. It has historically, but it's going to be doing a lot more, and you'll hear a little bit of that when Jonathan speaks at the very end. How can science contribute to these big global problems? One, of course, is continuing the science, and that's going to be advanced by international scientific collaboration. And so that's new science moving fast can create new opportunities, new solutions, new pathways for dealing with these things. And so APS has a very important role in lobbying the US government in terms of funding, in terms of removing restrictions that are inimical to collaboration, for example, to advance the scientific enterprise. The APS also has established for several decades units, the Forum on Physics and Society, the Forum on International Physics. They've done studies through their mechanism of carrying out studies on nuclear issues, on arms control of all types. So the APS has been involved a long time on public policy issues. What the plan in the future now is and it's true not only of APS, but other scientific professional societies, to become even more international, to internationalize the operation as much as possible. APS has this plan to become a welcoming global hub for physicists worldwide, both to advance science, but it's also to help accomplish some of the other things. I'm a great believer in the power of networks of like-minded institutions between countries. And a number of those have been formed in recent times. The Academies of Science created the Inter-Academy Partnership that Sherry much is involved in. It has a role both in academies of science around the world learning from each other, but also capacity building. And for example, with scientific communities in Africa, and other developing countries. There is the Global Research Council, which are the major funders of research, government funders of research. They've created their own network involves all the major funders, both developing countries, learning from each other. They're also, although they're involved mainly in fundamental basic research, I think how they can focus more on science that can actually contribute to solving some of our global problems. What the APS is doing is now planning to convene the physics societies from around the world to talk about, again, to learn from each other, talk about capacity building in countries that are emerging, but also some of the common issues that we face, and also hopefully trying to figure out how they can influence their own governments better to make contributions to solving these problems. So the fact that APS is itself becoming much more international in its outlook, it's looking at ways to cooperate with physics societies around the world to engage not only with the US government, but also to engage with governments elsewhere. So these networks are expanding cities, civil society organizations, subnational governments. So it's not only the governments of the world itself that can actually make progress on these solutions, even getting down to the local level. So I think there are lots of new mechanisms by which scientific engagement at all of these different levels, all of these different institutions can actually make progress faster.
Is there a challenge for an organization whose first name is American, after all, in presenting itself to the world as a global welcoming hub?
That has actually been thought about, and that's true. It still is. We believe in strengthening physics in America, but we believe that strengthening physics in America is also sympathetic with strengthening physics around the world, and that will also help physics in America. You know, the American Physical Society produces journals, and many of the authors in the preeminent journals in physics, many of the authors actually are not members of the APS. They come from many different countries. And so it makes perfect sense, even though the title is American Physical Society, not to take over, not to replace physics societies in other countries, but to actually try to provide more benefits to this much larger worldwide society of physicists, as well as to create partnerships with the physics societies in other countries.
Cherry, you can elaborate on that, but there's also a question from the audience I'd like you to take at some point here. Is an upside of the pandemic that we've learned how to hold virtual scientific meetings like the one we're doing right now that can engage scientists all across the world?
Yes, of course. That is definitely an upside because, well, it's also an upside for climate change because those scientists are not traveling on airplanes. Not that that's a huge part of our problem. It's a small part of the problem compared to changing all energy to renewables, which is about 90% of the problem. But yes, it's so much easier to have diversity, equity, and inclusion in a virtual meeting. And I'm very pleased to hear that APS will be doing hybrid meetings from now on.
Omololu, I imagine from where you sit, that is a silver lining from the pandemic as well. The fact that it's easier to participate in a situation like this than getting on a plane out of Rwanda.
Yes, so I think this is a very good aspect of the pandemic. I mean, the pandemic it's terrible and was terrible, but this is a good outcome from that. We have learned how to hold virtual meetings. The other day I was attending a meeting at Harvard online, at a physics meeting at Harvard, and ordinarily I wouldn't be able to do this, right? Because they won't broadcast it online and everything. But this time it was online and I could attend. So I think this is very good. And it's kind of levels the playing field so that many people can engage in science across the globe and learn from one another. So you really don't, even if you don't have the resources to go to Cambridge in the US, you can still get a lot of resources from them and learn from them. So I think this is a very good aspect of the pandemic.
Bill Collins, I suppose the counter argument to this would be that what we're talking about, this cooperation and collaboration, ultimately is a scientist to scientist, a human to human encounter. We're not talking about organizations necessarily, but people. And to the extent that we are kind of removed from each other, have we lost something? And how much do you think that personal dynamic is key to all that we're talking about here?
Well, we had a direct experience with that with writing the last assessment, where we suddenly went from having in-person meetings, which, to Sherry's point, were pretty involved a fairly large amount of expenditure of jet plane fuel, to online Zoom meetings. Fortunately, we'd already built the team dynamic. So I guess, Miles, the challenges I see here are with the virtual world are establishing a good team report, the front end, and thinking through how that works. I think being very intentional about it helps a great deal. My other primary concern, and I'm sure many of the others on this call share it as well, is that this is age differentiated impact. I think for people who are early in their careers, not being able to go to meetings, not being able to network with other people who are starting out in the field, meeting people who might want to hire them, that's had a very disparate impact across age ranges. And I think we all, again, have to be very intentional in how we ensure that the benefits that we're seeing are extend across career stages, or extend across nationalities, and extend across circumstances. Because my idea of not getting on a plane and being thankful for that is not shared by many of my early career colleagues who are desperate for in-person meetings.
Anybody else miss in-person meetings? Bill Colglazier, go. Jerry, I guess everybody does. Go ahead if you want to pick up on that point, but I have a question for Cherry after that. Okay,
just a quick comment that I learned in a conversation with my colleagues involved in diplomatic negotiations, that process is really important. The process is what gives people eventually trust in each other, even though they may have great disagreements. And the lack of the in-person meetings, I think it's much more complicated to get those benefits that come from working on the process together.
It's an important insight, I think.
Yeah.
Cherry, on the subject of old versus young, well, I should say mature, veteran. What? He said the gray-haired dude. How can we foster the enthusiasm of young physicists that they have for addressing global challenges? Do professors need to think about PhD training differently? Is it currently too disconnected from the world?
Boy, that's a difficult question.
You can punt if you want.
Not all physicists train their graduate students similarly.
Right.
But, as Bill Collins pointed out, he's kind of started out in physics, and his postdoc mentor got him super interested in climate. I think allowing, again, looking at things more holistically as let's just say you're a theoretical high energy particle physics physicist and you're training graduate students, and one of them comes up to you and says, I'm worried about geoengineering and I want to find out more about it. Instead of poo-pooing that, let them do it. We need the best minds on those problems.
Fair enough. All right, Omololu, here's a question for you. Having yourself, I think you're originally from Nigeria, studied in the US, now in Rwanda. To what extent can the APS minimize or at least lessen the impact of citizenship restrictions imposed on international students or researchers when it comes to grants, memberships, applications, et cetera, within the US?
Okay. Thank you very much, Miles. So I think this aspects are things that APS can easily do. The more complicated aspect will be to ask the US government to make certain changes, which I think APS is doing by doing some activism and talking to the government, to the Senate about these visa restrictions. So I think the APS is doing things related to that. But these other aspects are things when it comes to, well, it depends on the grants. When it comes to memberships applications, then yes, APS can do something about it. But when it comes to grants, of course, it depends on the granting agency. One thing APS can do is to continue what they're doing to foster collaboration between US scientists and scientists from other parts of the world. So I think the American Academy of Sciences has a program called CARE, and with this PER program here, African scientists scientists from other parts of the world and American scientists can team up together to apply for grants. So I think this is one thing that APS also can help with, to help to foster such programs where scientists from other non-US countries can team up with scientists from the US and work to get some grants. I think the ARL, Army Research Lab, and ARO, Army Research Office, have some programs also like that. So maybe we will publicize it more and get people to work together, and then people from outside Africa, outside the US, can get some of the grants through this collaboration. Thank you.
I have one more question for you from the audience, Omololu. Do APS journals do enough to enable publishing from scientists in the developing world? Will open access fees limit opportunities?
Okay, so what I would say is still along the same line. It would be good if APS fosters more collaboration between scientists in the US and scientists in, say, Africa. Because for one, in Africa, we need to increase the the quality of our publications. So not just to publish because we have to publish, but also increase the quality of the publications and also increase the impact of the publication. So people need to work on not textbook problems or problems that have been solved in the past. So APS can foster this collaboration with US scientists so that through the collaboration, African scientists can improve the quality of their publication and increase also the impact of their publication. So I think this is one important thing that APS can do. When it comes to open access fees, I have to say I've never paid fees to publish. Okay, so that means yes, my papers are not open access, but you can always put a copy in the archive for people, a draft in the archive for people to be able to access it. So I don't think you have to pay open access fees with APS, any of the APS journals. But you can publish. Yes, it will be open access, but you can always drop a copy in the archive before you publish. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we're getting close to the end here. Let's do kind of a lightning round here. I'm going to start with you, Bill Collins. If you had to pick, 1, 2, 3, pick your number, what would be the top priority items for the APS to do relevant to this discussion? What is the to-do list? Everybody out there is taking notes right now, so go ahead.
All right, we'll motivate new students to work on physics-based solutions to the climate challenge, foster international collaboration, and third, communicate these solutions to policymakers. And I will just, by way of mentioning this here quickly, Miles, we spent yesterday in congressional visit days with over 100 visits with members of Congress. So that's a key function of the APS, highly successful, run out of the Office of Government Affairs. And in fact, we spoke to the issue you just raised. So work on the science, work on collaboration, work on convincing our government overlords.
All right, Sherry Murray, what's your list?
Agree with all of those. I would add work on science education for all, especially children around the world.
Omololu, what's your top 3, if you have them, or at least the top 1? Have we lost him? Omololu, have we lost you?
Uh-oh.
I'm going to guess internet connectivity would be high on his list at the moment. But all right, Bill Colglazier, why don't you weigh in on your list? I know you've got one.
Yeah, in addition to the great ones that the other Bill and Sherry listed, I think the fact that the APS is internationalizing with this Welcoming Global Hub, and in terms of bilateral and multilateral dialogues with physics societies around the world, the APS has been one of the leaders in having the leaders of American physics talk to the leaders of Chinese physics about some of the current issues and problems between countries and how it's affecting the science. I think those kinds of dialogues are really important, and actually creating a network by which all the physics societies can talk about these challenges and how the physics community worldwide can influence things for the better in their own countries as well as collectively. I think APS can be very influential. But then, of course, as Bill Collins ended, continuing to lobby the U.S. government to do all the right things.
I think overlords was the word he used, which seems to fit pretty well these days. Just a quick thought here, slide in one more from the audience, which I probably would have sent in Omololu's direction, but you can probably handle this, Bill Colglazier. APS has sponsored collaborations between the U.S. and India, the U.S. and Brazil. Are there any such programs with countries in Africa?
Yes, one of the committees of the APS is the Committee on International Scientific Affairs. And one of the things that they've helped to create is a newsletter for physics in Africa. And so that's one of the things, again, it's all directed at capacity building, and so that scientists in Africa physicists in Africa can maintain contact with physics around the world. So capacity building, I think, has become an important issue that I think the APS is going to put a lot of thought in what they can do, especially for young scientists in other places around the world.
All right. Any other leftover items or closing thoughts? We have just a couple of minutes. Does anybody want to weigh in? Wave your hand. I'll come to you. Or have we exhausted this subject? All right. Well, yes, go, Bill Colglazier.
I'll just say one thing on the question to Sherry about the new generation, and can professors at universities do more to help educate their students, into these wider issues. There's a great interest in scientists doing that. In fact, at the University of Arizona, that Sherry knows well, there are teaching now some multidisciplinary courses. Students still major, in their own silo, but then they get together to talk about these global challenges, these other issues. And I think more of that at universities would be very helpful.
Including a science diplomacy initiative. Yeah.
Well, the problems don't fit into the silos very well, do they?
Oh,
so
we got
maybe academia has to respond, right? All right. I think
Omololu is back, Miles.
Oh, Omololu, are you there?
Yep.
Final thoughts from you. Anything first of all, I'm sure you might say that the APS should focus a little bit on internet connectivity, but tell me, what's your top item or items for the APS on a to-do list relevant to this discussion?
Okay. So I'm sorry I went off. Actually, what happened was I forgot to charge my laptop, so it wasn't charging.
Oh, so, no worries.
Yeah. So
been there, done that.
Yeah. So I think the top thing will be, I'll be happy if the APS could convene a meeting with the ministers of education and the ministers of ICT to help them develop a plan to have a drive for training scientists and engineers in Africa. So I think this would be my top thing. I'm not saying APS should train the scientists, but at least work together with some of the governments and top leaders in education in Africa to work with maybe the African physical societies to have a meeting of the Minister of Education and the leaders in education and science and technology. So the meeting should be a meeting where they develop an agenda and have a target to train people in science and teaching of science and also technology all over Africa. I think this will be my top request to APS at this time. Yeah, thank you.
All right. Excellent, excellent job. What a fabulous conversation. I enjoyed it very much. Omololu, Akin-Ojo, Bill Collins, Cherry Murray, and Bill Colglazier. Thank you all for your time. And thank you in the audience for participating. And on behalf of APS, I'm Miles O'Brien. Thank you for being a part of this annual leadership meeting. And we'll send it back to Jonathan, who has some further thoughts on this and an announcement. Jonathan?
Yeah, so thank you, Miles, and thank you, panel, for the discussion and really for all the great ideas. I mean, today in the panel, you discussed so many of the shared challenges that are facing the global physics community, from energy and climate to equity and inclusion. And you also gave us ideas as to how we as physicists can work towards addressing them. So I believe that as we move forward, it is imperative that all physicists from all parts of the planet be engaged in developing solutions to challenges that are both local and global in nature. That means that physicists worldwide must not only have access to the latest scientific research, but also to the larger scientific community to establish the collaborations and connections necessary to tackle these issues. And that is one reason why APS is positioning itself, well, not as the world's physics society, but as you heard from Bill, but as a welcoming global hub. In fact, APS members have already underscored the importance of this goal. When we recently surveyed 10,000 members worldwide, all members, regardless of nationality, rated being part of a larger physics community as the primary reason for APS membership. So what does we mean by saying a welcoming global hub? Well, it means that we offer a welcoming community to the world's physicists to connect with each other to advance their shared interests. In particular, that we offer an opportunity for all physicists to contribute to and benefit from the global physics enterprise. An opportunity for all physicists to build and strengthen relationships within the international physics community. And an opportunity for all physicists to benefit from expanded partnerships and collaborations between national physics societies and international physics organizations. So here's one example of this. In 2022, APS will be convening a roundtable of physics society leaders to sit down, roll up their sleeves, and figure out how societies can assist the global physics community as it takes action. This group was originally convened by the UK Institute of Physics during the early days of COVID-19. It is a nascent network of the type that Bill discussed today. Now, in 2022, APS will take the baton and lead the next series of discussions, which will likely center on issues connected to open science, research integrity, and how the physics community can strengthen open collaboration, that collaboration that nurtures us all. It is my hope that the participants will consider establishing this group as a permanent standing body, perhaps as the Global Physics Society Roundtable. Today, however, I want to underscore that APS is not merely facilitating discussions among leaders, but also building a community for all the world's physicists to connect with each other and advance their shared interests. This isn't a new strategy for APS. It is simply a natural evolution of what APS is already doing. APS already reflects the international nature of physics in that nearly 1/4 of APS members live outside the United States. Nearly 1/3 of March meeting participants come from outside the United States. And over 2/3 of the articles published in APS journals have authors from outside the United States. So at the end of the day, we need to ensure that all physicists, regardless of nationality or level of prosperity, can benefit from APS membership, meetings, publications, programs, the APS community. As we speak, the APS Committee on International Scientific Affairs is identifying actions that APS can take to better engage and serve physicists from all parts of the world. It is my hope that in 5 years, APS will be an organization that fully embraces who physicists are and all that they do. Wherever physicists are, whatever they're working on, APS will be alongside them, providing the help they need to thrive and to tackle our many shared challenges. So I would like to see APS meet physicists where they are, from classrooms to companies, from fundamental research to applied technology, from the US to Africa, from bachelor's to master's to PhD, no matter one's gender, race, ethnicity, identity, latitude, longitude. Now, that is an expansive mission. But if we succeed, in my opinion, APS will be doing its part to serve physicists worldwide. So thank you for joining us on this journey. Good night.